All right, are you ready? All right. Buenos días, ILA23. Bom dia a todos. I'd like to share with you my recent experiences with doing MVPs in the real world. But before I do that, I just wanted to share with you a very brief personal story that I'd like to share, which is that this is actually my third conference in South America. I went to Buenos Aires in 2014. It was a fantastic conference. This is my talk on designing for trust and confidence. And I also gave a workshop called Beyond Sketching Features. You might recognize some people here. Later, I went to Floripa, and I did a workshop and a couple talks. This one was on streamlined cognitive walkthroughs. It was a very dark conference, as you can tell from the photo. And what happened to me this June was I was preparing a virtual workshop for a team in Sao Paulo, and it was virtual, of course, so that means I wasn't able to go, but I started to think about how much I enjoyed the conference here in South America, and I was talking to my wife about what a wonderful experience it was, what a special experience it was, and we thought, you know what, it would be a dream come true if we were able to go back to Argentina and Brazil. And believe it or not, that very week, and I know that because I looked it up, this guy on the left, Santiago Bustelo, he contacted me and he said, hey, would you like to present at ILA23? And I said, absolutely. And so here I am today. And the reason I'm sharing this story with you is being here today in front of you is literally a dream come true for me and for my wife. And I thought that was special. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Muito obrigado. Let's talk about MVPs a bit. So I thought I'd give you a minimal, viable introduction or background about me. I thought that'd be appropriate so that you understand who I am and where I'm coming from. So, I've been doing this for a long time, UX design for a long time. After 30 years, you stop counting. And so I've worked for big companies. I worked at Microsoft for 10 years. I worked for small companies. My own company is one-person company. And before COVID, I basically had an international consulting company where I'd go to technical teams and train them how to do UX design. Unfortunately, COVID kind of ruined that business. So after COVID, I was more focused on consulting and contracting and helping people. I was doing front-end work and whatnot. So I've done a lot of MVPs in the last 3 years or so, but I am personally now working on my own project. I'm basically, I consider myself an aspiring founder, so I'm working on a project on my own, and I've learned a great deal from it. I'm actually a kind of a full stack UXer. I know how to code both front and back end. And when I talk about my MVP, I'm going to be talking about what I'm doing now, so just so you know what I'm coming from. All right, so MVPs are awesome. If you're a founder, I think this is one of the most important UX concepts there is because it really gives you clarity on what it is you need to be doing. However, what I've discovered is that MVPs are not as easy as it sounds. There's actually a great deal of challenges. There's a lot of difficulties in doing a successful MVP, which I want to share with you today. And when I do this, I just want to give you a bit of a warning. I am going to challenge traditional UX design thinking because, am I good here? Okay, because I think it very badly needs to be challenged. I think we're kind of stuck in our thinking. Have you noticed that the most popular UX books are 20 years old and 30 years old? You know, don't we need some more fresh, yes, we need more fresh thinking, right? So when I challenge traditional thinking, I'm not saying I'm right and everybody else is wrong, but I am saying that I have a different perspective, a different point of view that I'd like to share with you. And so I don't expect you to agree with everything I say today. But what I do want you to do is think different and see that there might be a different perspective on how we do things. All right, so first things first, what is an MVP exactly? Why don't we try to define what that is? So why do we need MVPs in the first place? Well, software products are very difficult to create, very expensive to create, they're very time-consuming, they cost a lot of money, they're very risky, and so the idea behind an MVP is to reduce that risk, because the last thing we want to do is create a product that nobody wants. That's like the classic thing that we've done in the industry, and we really want to try to avoid that with our MVPs. Now here's a definition from Jeff Gotthelf's book, Lean UX, and I'll read it to you. I think it's a fine definition, but I think we can do better. All right, so he says, MVPs are used to validate assumptions to minimize waste, right? So it could be the smallest thing to validate each hypothesis to decide to proceed, or it could be the simplest product that delivers value to the market. It could be a sketch, a wireframe, a prototype, or a demo. It could be a preview or a working product, and we want to design only what we need, so that's why it's a minimal viable product. Okay, this is a fine definition. You can use it if you like, but I have a couple issues with it. The first is I feel it's a bit mechanical. It's kind of mechanically this is what it is, but it doesn't really give us any insight as to what we're trying to accomplish. And also, I think it's too broad, too comprehensive. Based on this definition, what is not an MVP? It's pretty much everything, right? Could be anything from a sketch to a product. I think we need to narrow it down a bit. And I think one thing that's very important is we need to separate the idea of an experiment from a product. A product is a product. It's something we intend to sell, to make money from. An experiment is something that we want to test, that we're going to throw away. Let's separate those two concepts. So I wanted to come up with my own definition. And so the definition I came up with was, you know what? I think an MVP is a very carefully managed illusion. And it's a product, right? MVP product. It's not an experiment. It's not a prototype. It's not a mock-up. It's a product that we intend to sell. But it's a carefully managed illusion. And I was thinking that's a pretty good definition. And I started to think, you know, at Apple, they used to have this thing that they refer to as the reality distortion field. Are you familiar with that term? Reality distortion field? So, oh, right, sorry, I skipped a slide here. So, if you're doing it right, people will think you're almost done when in fact you're just getting started. That's kind of what we're after with an MVP. So again, going back to this reality distortion idea, Apple had this idea of a reality distortion field. And I was thinking that sounds very similar. So is it the same thing? So I thought I'd look it up, and I found this story that I thought was really interesting. So it says, Jobs pushed Wozniak, so Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, right, to create a game called Breakout. Woz said it would take months, but Jobs insisted that he could do it in 4 days. Woz knew that it was impossible, but he ended up doing it. Okay? So what's going on here? Well, I can assure you that Steve Wozniak did not do months of work in 4 days. What did he do? He did an MVP, right? He did a carefully managed illusion to create something that looked like a complete product, but it wasn't even close to a complete product. How long would it take? I'm willing to bet months. But he was able to give it to Steve Jobs and think that it was almost done. So this is an example of a carefully managed illusion. All right, so speaking of Steve Jobs, I think he actually has the best definition of an MVP that there is. And so I wanted to share this with you. Now this is okay. We'll fix this during the video. So let me introduce the video very quickly. This actually took place in 1997, and if you remember, at that point, Apple was almost ruined, right? And so Steve Jobs was taken back as interim CEO at $1 a year. So they had very little confidence in him, obviously. And he is at a developers conference, and he is being asked how they make decisions at Apple. And this is the response he gave.
You've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it.
You didn't hear the applause, right? There was no. All right. So, by the way, this is a great video. I recommend that you watch the whole thing. But the one thing that's really funny at this point is he talks about the importance of putting the customer first ahead of technology. One guy applauds. and stops, looks around, was like, oh, sorry. So that's like brilliant, right? Obviously, a developer conference. All right, let's move on.
It started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that? And I think that's the right path to take. I remember with the laser writer, technology in the box, and I remember seeing the first printout come out of it, and just picking it up and looking at it and thinking, you know, we can sell this. Because you don't have to know anything about what's in that box. All we have to do is hold this up and go, do you want this? And if you can remember back to 1984, before laser printers, it was pretty startling to see that. People went, whoa, yes.
Okay. I think that is the perfect definition of an MVP. Something that you can pick up, hold it in front of users, and say, do you want this? And the answer is yes. Or better yet, whoa, yes. That's what we're after here, right? With an MVP. All right, I got the fourth definition for you. And I used to not like the cupcake analogy, but I've grown to like it. So the thing I like about the cupcake analogy is, you know, why create the entire wedding cake when the cupcake will do, right? We don't have to create the whole thing. If we just want to taste, let's just do the smallest thing. So that would be a cupcake, right? So I love that part, you know, that makes complete sense. A thing that I really like about this analogy that nobody ever brings up is that for this to work, that cupcake has to be awesome, right? It has to be a tasty cupcake. Can you think of anything more useless than a bad tasting cupcake, right? It's like, okay, we're interested in getting a wedding cake. Okay, that's great. Here's a cupcake. Try it out. Tell us what you think. All right. Have you tried the cupcake? Oh, yeah, we hated it. It was disgusting. Oh, that's too bad. But you still want the wedding cake, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? The cupcake has to be fantastic to get people to be interested in the wedding cake. A small sample has to be great for this to work. Now, the one thing that I didn't like about this is it kind of trivializes what is involved here. Technology is not usually this simple. And so, you know, laser printers aside, it's very difficult to have a taste that's meaningful. So I thought we could just fix that by making it a meaningful, tasty cupcake, right? So, do you want this? People say yes, and that yes means something. It doesn't mean yes, it means yes, I'm a customer. Yes, I want this. Do you want this? Yes, I do. That's what MVPs are all about. All right, so this sounds pretty easy, right? It's like, Everett, what's the big deal? All we have to do is the minimum of something. How hard could that possibly be? So turns out it's really difficult. So there are trade-offs everywhere, okay? So everything you are doing in an MVP is a trade-off. So we're trying to minimize risk and minimize waste, for example. As it happens, if you minimize risk, you might be maximizing waste, and vice versa. We cannot optimize for everything simultaneously. You have to make very difficult decisions. Traps are everywhere. The things that we naturally do tend to be wrong. And if you don't have good strategy, if we don't have good execution, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of opportunity. And in order to illustrate this, my very first job out of college, a very long time ago, was with a company that was started with someone who was very well known in the high-tech industry. In fact, he was known as the guy who, I'm not mentioning any names, but he's the guy who was known as the person who could have been Bill Gates, but wasn't, or perhaps should have been. But we were in the CD-ROM retrieval system business. If you don't know what a CD-ROM is, you probably would have to go to a museum, computer museum, to see them. But those are the things we used to share large amounts of data before the internet, right? So we went to, after I joined the company, we went to the second annual CD-ROM conference in Seattle, and we were rock stars. I mean, it was just amazing. We had the product that everyone was showing, that everyone was talking about. We were the example of what the technology could deliver. And we were making deals. I mean, big money deals, $20,000, $40,000, $100,000. And this is at a time when the dollar was actually worth something. You know the feeling, right? So this is an example of a very successful MVP, right? Right? Unfortunately wrong. So we were not successful. So how is it possible to have such a good start and fail? And the answer is we had a mountain of technical debt. All right? And furthermore, all that business that we were getting made it very difficult to do anything about it. Right? So we basically had three choices. Right? The first is we could tell our customers that wanted to give us all this money to wait 6 or 9 months for us to figure out the architecture and redesign things properly. Or we could do whatever it took, even in losing money, to do the best we could with the technology we had. Or we could take the money and run. Right? So remember, this is MVPs in the real world. So it turns out the first option doesn't exist. The second option doesn't exist. We did that, and it didn't really work out that good. But you can see the problem. Even if you have something that everybody wants, if the technology isn't there, you can't deliver it, right? So that's, yeah. So when do you have the time to go back and fix things? And I think in this example, the correct answer was never. And I think the big irony behind this example is that our initial success was the thing that ensured our eventual failure, because we were too successful too soon with technology that wasn't ready yet. Okay, so now that example is completely real. This example here is completely fake. But I was thinking about a situation where, when would it make a great deal of sense to take on a great deal of technical debt? And that would be a project that would be very high risk, right? So we're doing something completely new. We don't expect to succeed. We really need to learn from the experience. So let's take on a tremendous amount of technical debt in this high-risk project. That would make sense, right, in that situation, wouldn't it? Well, so here's the thing. Oh, and of course, we're going to be lean, right? So, we're going to build, we're going to measure, we're going to learn, we're going to pivot, we're going to learn, we're going to measure. It's going to be great, right? That's what we want to do with this strategy. That's what lean is all about. All right, so taking on a great deal of tech debt is okay in this situation, right? Well, if you succeed, it is, but what happens if you fail? Well, we're going to learn from failure, right? But I'm not so sure about that. So here's the thing. If we fail, did we fail because the execution was poor, or was it the concept that's poor? Was it a poor concept, poor execution? We don't know. So here's the thing. I think that pizza is a brilliant concept, but the reality is bad pizza is still bad, right? So it's very difficult to learn. And furthermore, if someone were to take that concept and do a great execution, would they succeed? We don't know. We talk about failing fast and learning from failure, but my observation is it's really hard to learn from failure because we don't really know for sure what the problem was. All right, so a few facts of life that we have with MVPs. So, yeah, of course, what we want to do in terms of process, the lean process is basically at each step we evaluate what's going on, and either we continue or we pivot or we cancel. So that's what we're trying to do to reduce risk. All right, but one thing that's really important to understand is that nothing matters at all unless we actually deliver a product at some point. All our work means nothing unless it eventually makes its way into people's hands. And another thing I can add to this, by the way, is that if you're paying for everything, the world is a completely different place. You're a whole lot less fussy. You just really want to get things done. All right, so let's talk about strategy and priority. So it turns out that to have a successful MVP, we really have to have a strong strategy. So I want to explain what I'm thinking here. And I think we can break the world down into two plans, plan A or plan B. So plan A is where we're taking something that already exists and we're trying to make it better. Plan B is where we're trying to come up with something completely new, something that doesn't exist today. So as an aspiring founder, which of these plans makes more sense? Should I improve the user experience for something that doesn't exist yet? Or should I try to create a new market for a brand new product that doesn't exist? Should I do the UX thing or the market creation thing. Well, of course, I want to do the UX thing, right? That's the thing I know how to do. And I was strongly inspired by a very old book by a guy named Jim McCarthy. And his point was that a market without competitors ain't. And so we have this fantasy of, one day waking up and having this product idea and coming up with something completely new. But it turns out that's almost impossible. We can't do that on our own. We could do it if we had a huge pile of money, but if we don't have a huge pile of money, our best option is to try to improve the user experiences of things that are already out there. So, right, so it turns out that each of these plans has a completely different strategy, right? So if it's a low risk, something that we're improving the user experience, I call that plan A. What we want to do is focus on maximizing value, focus on differentiation, and we ultimately want to have a product that we can sell. Whereas by contrast, plan B, where we're trying to come up with a new market, we're really focused on validation, we're really trying to keep our risk under control, and we might not end up with a product. We might end up with learning where we have a better plan, we have a better understanding of what the marketplace really needs. And it turns out these are completely different types of MVPs. Now, you might have seen this cartoon before. It's from a guy named Henrik Nieberg. And I never really liked this one, to be honest, but I think I understand it much better than I... Thank you. I think I understand it much better than I used to because I realized, it's the two plans, right? The top is plan A, where we've got an existing product and we're trying to improve it, and the bottom is plan B, where we're trying to come up with something completely new that doesn't exist yet. And so the idea that he has in this cartoon is that at each point you have something that the user can use. But if we're improving an existing product, we don't really need that, right? So, the interesting thing is for plan A, the MVPs are not about using, they're about wanting. Do you want this? Yes. That's what we're after here. So, for example, even Tesla does, speaking of cars, Tesla does clay models so that you can feel the experience of the car before you actually create it. It's very important to be able to actually experience it before you actually create that metal. So, do I want this? Yes. Can I use it? No, I can't use this. Mazda has their new Skyactiv 3 motor out, and it's supposed to be as efficient as electric vehicles. Do I want this? Yes. Can I use it? No. And that's okay with plan A, because I already have an existing solution, right? So I think that's what's going on here, it's plan A versus plan B. I do want to point out that I understand plan B, but it's very, very difficult to do unless you've got a pile of money, right? It really takes a lot of money to get from a skateboard to a car, and what's more likely to happen is you get from point 1 to point 2 to point 3, you're fired because they ran out of money, and then they get to point 4, the funding dries up, and then point 5, the company goes out of business. Very difficult to do this without a lot of money. All right, so MVPs, a lot of people analyze the letters M, V, and P. Okay, so M, we kind of know what M means, although I want to clarify that a bit. We know what P means, right? It's a product that we're going to sell, a product or a service that we're going to sell. What exactly does that V mean? And I think that one's the hardest one to really understand. And the way I like to look at it is it's really kind of a placeholder, depending upon the immediate goal you have. You want to figure out what your short-term goal is. You want to be compatible with your long-term goal. But the V is all about fulfilling your goals. So, is this a thing we should consider doing? Is it something we should spend time on? Should we prioritize it? Should we fund it? Should we continue to fund it? And all the way down to having something that people can use and depend upon and being preferable to the existing solutions. So for my MVP, since I'm doing plan A, this is what I'm after. I want something that not only that people can depend upon, but also is preferable. They actually like it better than the existing solution. That's the whole point, right? All right, so the way I like to put it is, would you be willing to fly in your own MVP if it were a plane? Right? So it doesn't have to be completely finished, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you need to be able to take off, you need to be able to fly around a bit, you need to be able to land safely in order for it to be good, right? There's no point otherwise. We're asking our users to do this, so we should be willing to do it ourselves. Okay, so here's the thing then. So I want to explore what the M means, because it isn't necessarily as minimal as you might think. If we were to think of a spectrum going from 0 to 100, where 0 was basically, it's just minimally there and just barely works, versus 100 being it's almost done, it's looking great. The M doesn't mean like 10 or 20 or 30. I think it means more like 40 or 50 or 60. We want to be more in the middle, where we can get to that point where we have something good enough to fly around in, right? That lower end of the scale just isn't really good enough to really be worth considering. I also think it's important to have a day 0, a day 1, a day 7, and a day 30 strategy. So what is the user going to do on the first day, or even before they buy the product? That's day 0. First day, what does that look like? What do they need then? Day 7, what does that look like? The day 30, we can wait. That can be delayed. We don't have to do that yet, because if we don't have any customers, then the day 30 doesn't make any difference yet. All right, this is interesting. So a good question to ask is, how important is visual design for an MVP? And if you look at what a lot of guys are doing, they have fantastic visual design. They're just beautiful looking websites, beautiful looking products. But here's the thing, you can't do everything, and you can't do everything first. And if your goal is, to have people fall in love with your product, of course you want that great visual design, you want to get that emotional connection. But if you want that harsh, critical feedback to see if you're doing the right thing, it might actually be a good idea to delay that. Because people are emotional, they react emotionally to beautiful things. If something looks beautiful, they want it to be successful. If you have something that looks gorgeous, people are less likely to criticize it. And if your goal behind that MVP is to get that early validation, that early feedback, having something beautiful might actually get in the way. So, for what I'm doing with my MVP, I want it to look presentable. Beauty will come later, that's okay, but I want the thing I'm actually selling to be the star of the show. That's where all the emphasis is on. I'm not selling a website, I'm selling a service. So it's really important to make that look great, but everything else can wait. Okay, reducing risk and waste. Is writing code really the best way to reduce risk? All right, so at this point you might be thinking, okay, Everett, you're really overthinking this, you're overanalyzing it. This is all really simple, right? With an MVP, all we want to do is we want to create a bunch of crap. We want to give it to our users, and they're going to spend an enormous amount of time analyzing it and evaluating it, give us this brilliant feedback, and we're going to take that feedback and we're going to learn, and we're going to pivot, we're going to learn, we'll give them another bit of crap. They're going to do the same thing. We're just going to keep doing that over and over and over until we have a successful product. It's really easy, right? Right? Am I overthinking this? Well, I don't think so. I don't think so, especially for plan A. We just can't get away with that. So I actually think that we don't need to write code to reduce risk. That it turns out that we as UX designers, we have the tools and techniques to figure out how to reduce risk. We call it user research. We call it research. We know how to do that stuff, right? Muchas gracias. We know how to do research. We know how to reduce risk already. These things still work, even if we're doing an MVP. So that's the thing. Reduce risk through research, then we'll start writing code, right? So I think this is a great example. In the interest of time, we won't play this video, but if you're familiar with the story of Dropbox, what they did is they created an animated video that showed what Dropbox was all about, and they called it a magic pocket, and they tried to sell the idea that you could access your data, any kind of data, from any kind of device anywhere in the world. They created this animated video to show exactly why that's an important thing, why it has value. And apparently they had literally millions of people, millions of customers after this video was created. They didn't need to write code to sell the idea. They just needed to communicate what the value proposition of the product was. We can still do this. We don't need code for that sort of thing. All right, so how do I think we should reduce risk. Well, I think the important thing is, first of all, to focus on maximizing value. That's really the name of the game. That's what we're trying to do as UX designers. Let's delay whatever can be delayed. Let's do one step at a time, and we have to constantly reassess. Are we on the right track? Are we doing the right thing? And I do this every day. I ask myself these questions. All right, reducing waste. So this is a personal obsession with mine. I really am focused, especially since I'm paying for everything myself. Very important to reduce waste. I think this ultimately boils down to reducing tech debt, design debt. The more debt we have, the more costly it is to get things done. But as I mentioned before, I do think there's a strong trade-off between risk and waste. And since I'm doing Plan A, I'm doing something that already has an existing market. I have a bit more confidence where I can focus more on reducing waste than risk, because I have confidence that a market exists because it's already there. All right, so for Plan A, quite frankly, building that skateboard is 100% waste. I'm not doing that because I know what the car is. I don't need to see the skateboard first. All right, I'm old, okay, so that's something to do with this, but I could possibly be the only person left who still writes specs. But I think that specs are a great way of reducing risk and waste. And so, the way it's usually phrased is people will say, okay, who wants to read a 100-page spec? And nobody raises their hand. And okay, who wants to write a 100-page spec? And of course, nobody raises their hand. All right, but we don't have to make it 100 pages, right? Can we do 2 pages? Can we do 5 pages? Can we do 10 pages? Who wants to read a 2-page spec? Okay, don't raise your hand, I don't want to know. But I want to read it, okay? Because my thinking is, if my ideas can't survive a 2-page spec, there's absolutely no reason to write code. It's not going to survive the code if it can't survive a 2-pager, right? So I think specs are still an important thing. In Lean, they try to get rid of all the artifacts and everything. It's just conversations and stuff. I think specs are a great way to reduce waste and risk very inexpensively. Okay, so how do we get meaningful feedback? This is really the star of the show. This is the whole point really behind the MVP, is to get that early validation, that early feedback. So how do we do this? All right, so as it happens for my MVP, here are my priorities. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have a great user experience. As a UX guy, of course, that's the most important thing to me. I want to have a solid technology platform. As a code guy, that's really important to me as well. I want to have compelling features, of course, because that's the entire point of the MVP, is to have those features that people will prefer to have. Having a great UX is fourth. If you can't understand or don't understand why I separated UI from UX, that's a whole hour talk right there, unfortunately. Number 5 is I wanted to then focus on responsive design and mobile, okay? So those were my priorities when I started. Now, I had very early feedback from 4 people. Take a guess what the first feedback was. And of course it would be, it doesn't look good on my phone. So my last priority was everybody else's first priority. But remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get early feedback, early validation. We have to change our priorities. We don't want these problems to interfere with people giving us that early feedback. So I had to change my priorities. I still made great UX first, but I moved up responsive mobile design to second so that I could get past that. It just wasn't, worth worrying about that for very long. You've probably seen this chart before, right? It's a very popular chart. So the idea is, if you were to ask people, how many participants do you need in a usability study? Most technical people would probably guess like 20, to avoid bias and all that sort of thing. But it turns out we aim for like 4, 5, or 6. The idea is we maximize the return on each participant using this curve, right? But I strongly believe that this axis here, which I can't seem to point to, is mislabeled, right? It's not usability problems found, it's completely obvious usability problems found. Why? Because the obvious problems hide everything else. So let's say we test with 5 people, we get 20 problems, we fix the 20 problems, are we done? No, we test again, what we're gonna find? Another 20 problems, right? We fix those and we keep going, right? The obvious problems mask the difficult problems. So it doesn't really make sense. We can't really get meaningful feedback if we give an MVP that's full of obvious problems. Doesn't make any sense. Here's another challenge. It's not the customer's job to know what they want, right? A famous quote from Steve Jobs. What is he referring to? Well, if you remember way back in 2007, Apple came out with the iPad, all right? I think the iPad is possibly the product with the best MVP ever, which would be what? Be the iPhone, right? It's like, do you want this? Only big, right? That's what an iPad is. But if you remember when the iPad came out, was the feedback good? People were like, who wants this thing? Who wants this crazy giant iPhone? Nobody asked for this. And then Apple shipped it, and they're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. We want this, right? People didn't, and that's the best example we could come up with. You can't come up with a better MVP for a product than the iPhone for the iPad, and people still didn't get it. So we have to be understanding that that initial feedback is very, very challenging, right? So people won't necessarily understand what our value proposition is, right? Oh, actually, no, I'm on the wrong track here. So when I did my first MVP release to someone I didn't know, I got this bit of feedback here. So he said he didn't understand my value proposition. He said you're showing too much. He said you need to dial back everything. You're doing way too much. And he said I should be doing what everybody else is doing, all right? But there's a problem here, which is my entire point of doing what I was doing is I didn't want to do what everybody else is doing. It's the entire point and the heart of my value proposition was doing things differently. So was this bad feedback? I thought it was great feedback. Why? Well, there's an old saying that you should listen to your users, but ignore what they say. So what does that mean? Well, it means we have to interpret what people tell us, especially early on, right? We can't take the words and take them literally. We have to understand what they're really trying to tell us. And so what I heard is that he didn't understand my value proposition, which was right. He thought I was showing way too much, which was right. That's the exact feedback I needed at the exact time. So that was great feedback. The other stuff, let's deal with that later. I don't think that was as useful. All right. Yes. I have what I call Everett's Law of MVPs because I like to name stuff after myself. And so my law is hypothetical questions lead to hypothetical answers, right? So the more hypothetical the question we ask people, the less meaningful the response is that they give us. So going back to our cupcake, it's like, okay, you know, it doesn't taste good and it's full of bugs and it's really not ready yet. In fact, it's not really anything. But hypothetically, if we were to fix all those problems and give it to you, would you want it? And they say, well, maybe, hypothetically. What does that even mean? Right? It doesn't mean anything, right? The more hypothetical the question, the less meaningful the answer. So we have to make things real to get real information from it. Okay, yeah. Oh, well, point is we have to design for this. We have to understand that that's a problem. All right. Another challenge is we have this idea that we're going to keep going back to our users and they're going to give us more feedback, and we keep going back. We've got this dialogue, this conversation. Quite frankly, for a lot of people, you're going to do that once, maybe twice. Now, if they have a vested interest, they're an investor, they're a stakeholder, of course you can go back to them constantly. But the reality is most people, they give you feedback once and they're kind of done. So you have to keep that in mind as well. You just can't keep going back to the same people and expecting them to give you serious feedback. So it turns out that very often your first impression is in fact your only impression that you will have when you're doing an MVP. All right, the two biggest lies ever told. Number one, don't worry, it's just an MVP. Number two, let's just get something out there in people's hands. And actually, number three, you can't release too early. I don't really think these are true because of this problem, that it's so hard to get meaningful feedback, that if we give things that just they're not real and they're full of bugs, the feedback we're going to get just isn't going to be that meaningful. All right, learning and pivoting. Oh, 1 minute left. Oh, shite. I've got 1 minute left. Okay, we're not talking about this. Sorry. We're not talking about that. All right, I'll give you this one. Okay. Shit. All right, so meaningful yes. All right, so this is just an idea I wanted to share with you. So you know about NPS, right? So how NPS works. So only a 9 and a 10 score any points. So what I want to do is to encourage you to do what I call designing the 9. I want you to design that in. Why you put it in front of people and say, do you want this? And they say yes. I want you to tell me why they're going to say yes. What is it about your product that's going to make people love it and give you that 9, give you that 10? That's not going to be by accident, right? We have to design that in. All right, skip that. Sorry. All right, summary. I'm done here. All right, so here's the thing. All right, so if we ever meet again, and I hope we do, and you say, oh, you're that guy who gave that talk about MVPs, right? Here's what I want you to remember. Okay, number 1, the M does not mean minimal quality. What it means is we want to have that carefully managed illusion to get that early feedback, that early validation, and so we want to do the least to achieve that at the time we need it. It's not about minimal quality. We actually need really high quality. We need that tasty cupcake for this whole thing to work. V means that's kind of a placeholder for whatever our short-term goals are, but we need to, the viable means we need to achieve our goal for the task at hand. The P means it's a product. It's something that you can hold up in front of your users and say, do you want this? And the answer is yes, or better yet, whoa, yes. And a couple bonus is, let's just get something out there. Don't worry, it's just an MVP. That might not be the best advice. I'm not totally sure about it. But if we do an experiment, a minimal viable experiment, don't worry, it's just an experiment. We will throw it away. That works. We can do that. We have to separate experiments from products. Okay.